I want to talk about the story of the woman who touched the hem of Jesus' garment. She had been bleeding for 12 years. She was considered completely unclean and filthy and unworthy and a total outcast in her society. She was seen as having absolutely no value. And she wasn't allowed to touch anybody during or for a week after her bleeding. But since the bleeding pretty much never stopped, that was all the time. So she must have lived with an overwhelming sense of shame all the time. Even drawing water from the well must have been an ordeal. To find a time to go when no one was there, to walk through town and face the cruel stares and judgment of others, to be treated as though she had sinned and that was why she was afflicted with this condition, to be abandoned by her family and her friends for religious tradition that blamed her for something she had absolutely no control over. She was probably childless, and we know she was infertile, not allowed to go to the synagogue. She was poverty-stricken, just considered unclean. She may have married young before all of this started in her body, but no doubt if that's true, her husband divorced her. And can you imagine that she probably just hated the religious people of the day? She might well have blamed God for what was going on and hated him. We know she was taken advantage of professionals who never helped her and took all of her money, but none of this was her fault. Now, does this sound familiar to you? This woman spent 12 years in a society that considered her a complete outcast. Don't you think that her self-perception was pretty warped? Can you imagine the cognitive dissonance that she must have felt, like within herself, like blaming herself, but just hoping that what everybody was accusing her of wasn't true, but not knowing what she had done wrong, And do you think maybe she even came to a place of just hating herself, of hating her body for betraying her, of wishing that she were dead, of waking up every day feeling pretty hopeless, of just feeling dread when she saw that blood starting again? And do you think she prayed for years asking God to remove this from her, to heal her, to let her have friends and a community and acceptance, and to just have a moment of peace from this self-hatred? And then one day, she heard about Jesus. And she broke every rule to go seek him out. She risked everything by approaching him, not only defiling a holy man, but defiling everybody in the crowd just to reach him. What a beautiful act of desperation on her part. And there was still something inside of her that felt worthy enough to be healed and to be accepted again. But can you imagine how frightening it was when Jesus turned around and said, "Who touched me?" I'm sure she was expecting condemnation and scolding from him. But then he looked at her in the eyes with that look that said he understood, that he had walked with her during her entire journey, and that he felt her pain, and he felt her loneliness, and he felt that sorrow and that suffering and that self-hatred. And then he turned to her and he called her daughter. Do you know that she is the only person in the Gospels that Jesus calls daughter? I think that her broken-hearted father was reassuring her that he had never, ever turned his back on her the way everybody in her life had and the way everybody probably had said he had. He was telling her that he loved her. He had never rejected her, that he saw who she was under that burden of shame, that he wanted to heal all of her self-rejection and self-hatred. And Jesus accepted her. He made her clean again. He removed the stigma. He restored her back to herself and to others again. And she was never unclean in his eyes. She hated herself because of religious lies and a culture that scorned women, but he had never put that burden of judgment on her. She had never done anything, she had not done anything wrong to bring this on her. So, I mean, Jesus shows us that how God thinks of us as women. He never sees us as second-class citizens. But isn't this woman's story our story too? Being estranged from ourselves, blaming ourselves for things that are not our fault, taking on the lies of the abuser, the church, the culture, believing that because other people choose not to love us, that means that we're unlovable. Being judged and condemned by the church and treated as outcasts. And when we speak up about abuse, when we get a divorce, treated as if what we are going through was of our own making, and it wasn't. And some of us are treat part of ourselves as an outcast. The hurting part, the confused part, the traumatized part, the part that carries all of our shame. When we feel shame, we lose touch with all the glory of who we are as God's beautiful daughters. Thankfully, Jesus has transformed the shame. He never despised us. He stared shame in the face, and he hates shame. He despises shame. It says that in the Word. So we can stand at the foot of the cross and see that Jesus bore all of our shame. He refused to let any shame define him or diminish him or keep him from completing his purpose. He overcame shame, and now he sits in glory. And there are so many beautiful scriptures about not being ashamed. And I mean, no wonder, since shame is from the enemy. God knows how much it cuts us to the core, and it separates us from him and from living in his love. And that's just, he hates that. So I look at these scriptures. I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from all my fears. Those who look at him are radiant, and their faces shall never be ashamed. In you, Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be put to shame. Both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family, so Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Anyone who believes in him will never be put to shame. At that time I will deal with all who oppress you. I will rescue the lame. I will gather the exiles. I will give them praise and honor in every land where they have suffered shame. Fear not, for you will not be ashamed. You will not be confounded, for you will not be disgraced. You will forget the shame of your youth, and the reproach of your widowhood you will remember no more. So while we're doing all this work on guilt and shame and self-criticism and self-rejection, I hope you'll remember that Father calls you daughter. Our Father calls you precious and lovable and beautiful and worthy and valuable. We are the ones that Jesus came for: the wounded, the weak, the oppressed, the vulnerable, the broken, the desperate, the poor in spirit. He wants you healed because you are his wounded, beloved